Remember stories like this from the late 1980s?
In New York, Tracy Watson, who is 6 months pregnant, smokes crack cocaine, usually 20 vials, $100 worth a day. She knows the risks to her baby.
Chances that the baby could come out premature, deformed. Really, it's the health where it can come out addicted too.
That was the grim future predicted for the so-called crack babies born to drug-addicted mothers. Infants thought to be doomed for life with developmental and physical disabilities, destined to drop out of school or commit crimes. But that turned out not to be quite true. According to Maureen Black, a professor of pediatrics and epidemiology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, the crack baby scare was overstated and not substantiated. She is the lead author of a new review of 27 studies covering 5,000 children. The research found only subtle differences in the behavior of kids exposed to cocaine in the womb and those who weren't. In fact, some studies say the cultural assumptions about the crack babies may do more harm than the drug itself. For a closer look at the real impact of drugs on our society, I'm joined by Carl Hart, Associate Professor of Neuroscience and Psychology at Columbia University, and the author of High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs in society. Back with me are also former judge and criminal defense attorney William Murphy, Washington correspondent for The Nation magazine John Nichols, and editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com Michael Skolnick. So I want to start with you, Carl, because this book was really, in fact, quite intense to read, in part because of moments like challenging our fundamental assumptions, like the crack baby narrative, about what drugs do and don't do to us. What are the big myths that we have about drugs?
There are multiple myths. I guess one of the biggest myths is that the majority of people who use drugs like crack, heroin, methamphetamine are addicted, when in fact they are not. The vast majority of people who use drugs, for example, 85% or so, do so without a problem. But yet, most of our attention is focused on this small pathological numbers of users.
And when you say addiction, the way you define it in the text, you say an addiction is not just about regular use, right? That's just a pattern of behavior. Addiction is when it creates problems in your family life, in your work life, in your sense of self. And so you're saying that for 85% of drug users, that is not the circumstance.
That's right. If one of the things that people will help people think about this more reasonably is just think about alcohol. We know people who use alcohol on a daily basis, a glass of wine here and there.
Yeah, I live in New Orleans every
exactly.
That's on a daily basis, right?
Exactly.
That's not even an indictment.
Yeah, no, at all.
Problem if you don't.
That's right.
So when we think about how we use alcohol in this society, there are people who use cocaine in that way.
And yet there's a way in which the social norms, the stereotypes that came as part of this kind of moral panic around it, created real policy interventions. In fact, in some cities, the desire and the ability and the laws to lock up women who were found with traces of cocaine in their system, that they could be incarcerated if they were pregnant.
Yeah, you are a historian, well, you're a political scientist, but you know history.
Yep.
So if we go back to turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, these sorts of things were done with powder cocaine in terms of black people. There was a 1914 article in the New York Times called "The Negro Cocaine Fiend is a New Southern Menace," in which it was described that black people on cocaine are more murderous, they are unaffected by bullets, they rape white women, a wide range of things. So drugs have always been used as an excellent scapegoat to go after those groups in which we don't like in this society.
Now, one of the things I love most about the book is the way in which you talked about what happens to rats, right? So a lot of what we know about how brains respond to drugs has to do with what we know from animal studies. The idea that rats, when kept in lonely cages, solitary, without social supports, without other things to do, without sex, do a lot of drugs all the way to the point of death. But if they have, you know, a girl rat in there with them and they've got some friends and family and something to run around on, they do less drugs.
Yeah, it's just like us. If we have some alternatives, some things that compete with drugs, somebody you like, some other activity, the likelihood of you using drugs, certainly to a pathological point, is decreased. And we know this, and we have known this. But the problem is that that hasn't been emphasized, in part because drugs are great scapegoats. They increase the budgets of not only law enforcement, but also researchers.
Right. I love your research where you actually are giving. So I want to ask one last question, then we'll start to pull other folks in here because we're going to keep going on this. But this was, I had a couple amen moments reading the book. We'll talk about some of it as we go forward. But one of it was just this, that data show that teens who are either not caught or are given non-custodial sentences for their crimes related to drugs do better in terms of employment, education, and reduced recidivism than those who are incarcerated or otherwise removed. What that suggests to me, right, what those data suggest to me is that the problem isn't the drug use. The problem is being, like, so if you use drugs but you're never caught, i.e. if you are from a privileged community.
In other words, if you're white.
Right, white and privileged, right? You have to also be, so if you're a college student who's doing the drugs between classes, that the real problem, the loss of employment, the loss of educational opportunities, the loss of social standing comes from the incarceration, from the arrest, not from the drugs.
Well, one of the things I tried to do in my book, in High Price, was to use myself as an example.
Yep.
So if you look at me, I certainly did drugs as a youth. I certainly engaged in petty crime. And there were friends of mine who did the same thing, but they got caught. They got caught up. Their lives are currently destroyed. I'm a professor, a tenured professor at Columbia.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's the sort of anecdote that supports the empirical information.
Yeah, I mean, our last three presidents,
Yes.
President Obama has admitted to having some recreational drug use. President Clinton to some recreational drug being aware aroundness.
Touching it.
Right, touching it, but not inhaling. And of course, a president who had an alcohol problem in the
Also marijuana.
Yes.
Right, absolutely.
All right, I'm bringing everybody
And by the
else
way,
in as soon as we get back from the commercial because we are just getting started. This book is setting the table for us, but we are talking about the drug war in black and white when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Melissa Harris-Perry. This is a new report. It's a big one. It was released just this week from the American Civil Liberties Union, and it unequivocally lays bare the truth about our national drug policy. And the truth of that policy is this: it's biased, it's broken, and it is costing us billions. The ACLU's analysis took an in-depth look at the enforcement of marijuana possession laws. And here's what they found. When it comes to marijuana, use rates among black and white Americans are nearly equal. In fact, in every year from 2001 to 2010, more white folks than black folks between the ages of 18 and 25 reported using marijuana in the previous year. But when the ACLU looked at who our justice system condemns to criminality because of that use, the analysis found a vast inequality. Black people are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested than white people who light up at the same rates. And between 2001 and 2010, most of these arrests, 88% of them, were for simple possession. Not people like the suburban mom charged with running this $3 million pot operation. No. The vast majority of people whose lives become ensnared in the criminal justice system after a marijuana arrest were found with just enough for personal use. Those cases where someone was busted for simple possession account for nearly half of all drug arrests. The ACLU calculated one marijuana arrest every 37 seconds in 2010. That's every 37 seconds that you should imagine money flying out of your pocket, because the price tag for enforcing the marijuana possession laws that enable those arrests is $3.6 billion of your taxpayer dollars. In exchange for your money, here's what you get from drug policy: a complete failure to decrease the availability or use of marijuana, and hundreds of thousands of people, disproportionately African American, whose lives are often irrevocably changed by entering the criminal justice system. Here with me now is Carl Hart, Associate Professor of Neuroscience and Psychology at Columbia University. He's also served on the National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse and is the author of High Price. Judge Billy Murphy, a criminal defense attorney and former circuit court judge for the city of Baltimore. John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation and author of Dollarocracy. And Michael Skolnick, editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com and political director for Russell Simmons. All right.
Yeah.
Is there anything in this that isn't just that we didn't already know?
No, there's nothing in it. There's nothing in it that we didn't know if we were paying attention.
Yep.
But it is still very, very important. In a way, it's like the NSA stuff we were talking about before. We know a lot of stuff, but to have it confirmed, to have the data, to have it come out, and to force this conversation that we're having right here, it comes in context, because there's something I happen to think of as very, very positive going on in this country. Across this country, people are voting to strike down these laws against marijuana. We have statewide referendums across this country, local moves to decriminalize, even to legalize. And that's so vital, because the fact of the matter is, everything this study shows us tells us that the only way that we're going to begin to address this is with removing those laws.
Yeah,
you cannot change
right. What this report ultimately comes down to is saying, look, you just simply have to legalize marijuana for 21 and above. You have to create certain kinds of rules around it, right, the same way that we have around alcohol. But you just can't expect an enforcement that isn't biased as long as it's illegal.
Melissa, I don't know if we need to legalize marijuana.
Okay.
I mean, as I delineated in my book, I think the first thing we need to do is decriminalize it.
And that's the key.
So decriminalization means that it's still illegal, but people can't get a criminal record for it. So I think that's the first step. And then the second step we need...
Help people who are listening to understand the difference. Give me something in this world that is illegal but not criminalized.
Okay, let's think about driving. When you have a driving infraction, instead of sending you to jail, you pay a civil fine. That's decriminalization.
Okay.
And that's what I argue for in terms of marijuana and all drugs, in fact. But in terms of the legalization, one of the things that concerns me is that the country is like adolescents. They're infants when it comes to drug education. There are so many myths and misunderstandings that people will get in trouble if you do have a widespread or wide availability. So criminalization for me is an intermediary step in where we can have a corresponding amount of education that goes along. And then if we want to reevaluate and think about legalization, that's fine.
Then that's possible.
Now, why do you say all drugs should be decriminalized? That's a very important.
No, that's a great point. I say that all drugs should be decriminalized because drugs are just like automobiles. In this simple fact, just like automobiles, they are potentially dangerous, but we know how to minimize the harms associated with automobiles. We can do the same thing with drugs. But the American public, has been misled to believe that drugs are so dangerous that they cause these extreme brain changes. Simply not true. Not supported by the weight of the evidence.
Is it not true that drugs... Are you making the claim that illicit or illegal drugs are simply not that different than those things that we get via prescription or over the counter? Or are you saying that drugs really don't have that much of an impact on our brain chemistry? Because I'm just thinking, people who are going through everything from cancer treatment to infertility treatment recognize that when you put a substance in your body, it can make enormous physiological difference.
You make an excellent point. When we think about a drug like methamphetamine, for example, and do you know Adderall? Adderall is the attention deficit disorder drug.
Which we hand out to kids.
That's right, and they are the same drug. I mean, my research shows this, other people's research shows this, I talk about it in the book. They're the same drug. When we think of drugs like morphine, which we use for pain, exact same drug as heroin.
Or OxyContin.
Or OxyContin, the rest of these things. Now, that's not to say that people can't get in trouble with these drugs. It's just simply to say that we know how to decrease harm and we know how to use these things.
But Carl, doesn't that also take us to the issue of self-medication?
Okay.
We have a lot of people who in a broken healthcare system are looking for something to ease a pain, and we have a lot of our drug problems in this country are legal drugs. Right?
But if I could just, back to the ACLU report for a moment, if I could. The challenge is the ramifications of the racial bias of our drug policy, right? Exactly. Stop and frisk here in New York. Right, we have more marijuana arrests under stop and frisk than gun arrests.
Right, it turns out it sucks for guns. Not so bad for marijuana.
And so here's what happens, right? A 13, 14-year-old kid gets picked up for possession. He goes to jail for a night, just one night. He goes to jail and says, Judge, I could do this. But I could do a night. And then the next weekend he gets picked up. He gets the weekend because the judge is not in on Friday. He got to wait till Monday. He does the weekend. I could do a weekend. And then I could do 6 months. I can do 18 months. I could do 36. I could do 6 years. I could do 55 years. I'm 65 years old and dying in jail. So it's conditioning young black and brown young people, right, of a life in prison.